welcome to 1+1, where my guest is the 70s pop icon, John Paul Young.
Love is in the air. Love is in the air. Oh.
One of the most popular figures in Australian music, John Paul Young was apprenticed to work in a factory before luck steered him towards some of the greatest names in music production. A string of hits in the 70s saw him catapulted to the golden age of television through Molly Meldrum and Countdown. The voice behind Pasadena, Yesterday's Hero and Love is in the Air, John Paul Young is on tour with the All-Star Band, singing the creations of Harry Vanda and George Young in the Vanda and Young Songbook. John Paul Young, welcome to 1+1. It's great to see you.
Thank you.
So, in preparation for the interview, I was looking through some of the ABC archives, and there is a treasure chest devoted to you, which includes some fantastic pin-ups.
Oh, that's probably one of the better ones, yeah.
Quite a sultry expression.
Yeah, well, that's why I'm saying they're probably one of the better ones. I mean, I was hoping you didn't bring the one out of me on the phone in the bath.
So were you aware that you, in a sense, had to have a kind of clean-cut image?
No, it was kind of like I'd been put on this treadmill, and that's what you do. You know, in my head, it was probably no different to being a sheet metal worker. You know, you get put in the factory, and that's what you got to do.
I'm going to come to your sheet metal working days in a moment. But just going back to this fantastic archive, there's another wonderful thing, which is from Albert Productions. That was the company that, you know, produced you, the music from Vanda and Young. They worked for Albert's. And it was when you changed your name from John to John Paul Young. Have you ever regretted that name change?
Well, I haven't regretted it. I just haven't liked it very much. It's just one of those things that happen. You know, I was in no position to argue the point. You know, they were just saying, well, we've got a Johnny Young down here, and here you are, a John Young. It might be better if we had some sort of division in there. And it, you know, it took quite a few months of wrangling, and you know, I mean, every name under the sun you can think of, they were throwing at me, and it was in frustration one night. They said, you know, you must have a middle name, or my middle name, because being Scottish, it was my mother's maiden name, so that wasn't very much good to them. So I happened to mention that my confirmation name was Paul, and they said, that's it, and I was stuck with it. So here I am, still stuck with it.
So your family migrated to Australia from a place called Bridgeton?
Brigton.
Oh, Brigton.
Well, that's the way the Scottish say it.
Was
anyway,
that a suburb of Glasgow?
Yeah, in Glasgow's southeast. You know, it was a little working class suburb. I mean, it sounds a bit archaic now, but it wasn't as bad as it sounds. There was 7 of us in a 1-bedroom unit, you know. But we didn't feel crowded out or, you know, underprivileged or anything like that, you know, even though we didn't. I'm pretty sure Mum and Dad didn't have any money.
Because you were 11, it was 1962 when you arrived in Australia. Do you know what the push factor getting your parents out of Glasgow was?
My dad just looked around him, and he didn't see much future. He didn't see a future for his children, you know, so he...
What did he do?
He was an aircraft maintenance man, you know, an airframe fitter during the war. But he was also basically a stonemason. That was his trade. So at the end of the war, he continued his trade as a stonemason, but on weekends he would do the, what do they call it, like the Air Force Reserve. So he'd do that on a weekend, and 2 nights a week he worked in a bar. And he didn't drink back then. Australia soon fixed that up. But he was shorter than me, and he was part of his job was to be the bouncer.
You played the piano accordion, and you've said you had a really musical family, but
Yeah.
not in the sense of, they played instruments or
No.
they were opera singers.
Yeah.
Yeah, so where did the music come from?
Just through a need to entertain yourself. I think that's what it was, like every relative I could think of sang. And, if you were sitting in a room full of Glaswegians in those days, they basically point at you and it was your turn. And they didn't care if you could sing or if you couldn't sing. And if you said, I don't want to sing, I'll say a poem, they'll say, fair enough. And they would insist on everybody being quiet while you delivered your performance. And if you were lucky, they'd join in.
So Scotland is renowned for having fierce winters. Your family arrives in Australia, I think, the summer of 1962.
Yeah.
Were your parents initially happy they'd made the move, or was it very tough?
It was tough, but they were happy. They were happy they'd made the move, yes. Where East Hills Migrant Hostel was in a hell of a place. It didn't have much transport. So the biggest battle that my father had was getting a licence and getting a car so that he could drive to work.
And what kind of work did he do?
I think he started off in a washing machine place, but he finished up back where he really wanted to be, and that was at Bankstown Aerodrome, working on aircraft again. Yeah.
So when you finished school, you became an apprentice and
Yeah.
you actually got a job in a sheet metal factory.
Yeah.
So was that the expectation for you and your siblings?
Yeah, well, I wanted to be an electrician, but I've got slight colour vision problems, so I wasn't allowed to be an electrician. I wouldn't have minded, it sounds a bit far-fetched now, but I wouldn't have minded flying an aeroplane, but that was out of the question too because of the colour vision. And I was left to sit alone and stew about what I was going to do, but not for very long. Dad just said, come with me, and we went to a few places and finished up at Commonwealth Engineering. And he said, I want you to give the lad a job, and that was it.
And there you met a factory worker, an old codger named Dougie. Do you remember Dougie?
Dougie Fussell, yes.
What did Dougie tell you?
Well, I was quite happy with my little band. We used to work on weekends, and everything was fine. And
This was Elm Tree?
Yeah, Elm Tree, and I was quite happy to let things just roll along. And it wasn't until one very hot day, probably about mid to late 30s degrees, that is, on a Saturday, and Dougie and I were working together, and the sweat was just pouring off us. And I said to Dougie, this is no good at all. And he just looked at me and he said, never mind, Johnny, the first 40 years are the worst. And that was it for me. That just broke me. I just went, I can't see myself here for 40 years. And I thought, well, I'm doing something else. Maybe I should put a bit more effort into what I'm doing with the band.
So you were the singer in the band,
Yeah.
but the band didn't continue forward. It pretty much disbanded, didn't it?
Mm.
So when you left, within a short space of time, some really good things
Yeah.
happened. You got a role in Jesus Christ Superstar, but
Yeah.
also you somehow bumped shoulders with this really big, fancy cigar-smoking record producer who'd produced T-Rex,
Yeah.
Simon Napier Bell.
Yeah.
How on earth did you manage that?
Well, life is full of funny things, and this is one of the funniest ever. He was a friend of Ted Albert's, and Ted Albert was the boss of Albert's Music, and he was here on holiday, and he went to see Ted, and both of them being right into music, Ted gave him a copy of Pasadena and said, every time we try and re-record this thing, it doesn't work. And his answer was, well, let's just use that. Let's not try and re-record it. Let's just use what we've got. And he said, how are we going to do that? And he said, well, if we play with this frequency and that frequency, we can squash George Young's voice down and we'll get somebody else to sing on top.
But how did they find you?
I think I'm only guessing this. We were working with a band called Velvet Underground, which was a Newcastle band. And in that band was Malcolm Young, famously from AC/DC. And I'm pretty sure what happened was that Ted said, why don't you go and have a look at this band that Malcolm's got and see if you can, maybe that lead singer would be interested. And it just so happens that that lead singer was also the lead singer in my band. We had two singers, and he had only left my band 3 or 4 weeks before and joined Velvet Underground. So this guy asked this friend of mine, would he like to record a song? And he said no. He said, I've just joined Velvet Underground. I don't want to ruin anything. I want to stay with the band. And he said, go and ask him. And so he came over.
That was you.
It was. So he came over and asked me, and he hadn't heard me sing a note because we'd finished our set by the time he turned up. And this is the most amazing thing. He said, would you like to record? And I said, yes. And he puffed on his cigar and he said, can you be at Albert Studios at 139 King Street tomorrow? And I said, yes. And I turned up there with my blue overalls on and my hair was right down to the bottom of my spine. And I could see the look on Ted Albert's face when I walked in. It was like, what is the cat dragged in here, And luckily for me, they accepted my vocal talent and off we went. And all of a sudden I'm on an aeroplane for the first time in my life and being flown down to Melbourne into Armstrong Studios, which was the studio in Australia in those days. So he succeeded in squashing George's voice down. He put my voice on it. He put a choir on it. He put the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra on it. And lo and behold, there we had Pasadena.
Such a long, long way to Pasadena.
I have to ask you, this famous drum beat that
Yes.
Vanda and Young were well known for, do you remember the first time you came across that? And what did you think about like this really even but slightly different drum beat?
Well, the even thing was always something that they had a problem with, because I don't know, if you listen to anything from the late 60s or the early 70s now, drummers in those days were very much carried away with their own proficiency. And it was incredibly difficult to get a drummer to sit there and play the same beat for 4 minutes and not put a fill in. And that's why they basically were responsible for inventing the tape loop, because they couldn't actually get a drummer to do what they wanted to do. So they'd take a piece of it and just repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and loop it. It was nothing to see George and Harry walking around the studio with a bit of tape around their neck. That was the drummer.
So by the time Countdown came along,
Yeah.
you appeared regularly on Countdown, both as a guest and as a performer.
And here is a platinum album for the John Paul Young album. Come on!
A lot of people have commented, including producer Michael Shrimpton, that in a sense, Countdown, the advent of kind of colour TV,
Yeah.
bands on TV, made you.
I think to a certain extent he's right, but you can never forget what George Young and Harry Vanda did for me. And, if I didn't have that vehicle to be on, then I don't think the success would have been anywhere near as big. It was a perfect marriage of everything. Everything came together at the right time. I was so fortunate in that I'd known Molly for 2 years before Countdown even started. So there was none of this. I wasn't scared of Molly, whereas most people were. And to me, he was just another guy. So it was a nice dynamic that we had on camera.
Now listen, I'm getting very confused, right?
Why, man?
I tell you what.
I'm not getting confused at all. I know exactly what's going
That
on.
was pretty fierce, that one.
I know exactly
I tell
what's
you what.
going
Now
on.
listen, that was Sue and Alfonso from New South Wales.
Lucky Alfonso from New South Wales.
Woo-hoo! And listen, the Standing in the Rain, mate, you had that a big hit in Europe.
Big.
Very big hit in Europe,
Yeah.
right? And out of Europe now comes Eruption with I Can't Stand the Rain. They probably mean they can't
Yes.
stand you, mate.
And God bless Michael for allowing idiots like us to actually compare the show. It was a very brave move on his part, and I I do agree with what he said, but I think George and Harry have to be put in there as well.
When you sang and performed songs like Yesterday's Hero,
Yeah.
were you aware of the words that you were singing? Because, of course, this was the song that Vanda and Young wrote about the Easy Beats. It was about
Yeah.
the fleeting nature of fame for a pop singer.
Sure.
Did
Yeah.
you think about that at that time?
Yes, I did.
You did?
Yes, I did. And I distinctly remember being in that booth and thinking, God, with a bit of luck, this might apply to me one day.
This might apply to me one day.
Yeah, because I was no hero at the time. This was only the second time I'd ever had a record out.
Look at me, I'm yesterday's hero. And yesterday's hero is all that I'm gonna be if I don't get together. Make a new start and be somebody better. All that I'll be if I don't get together now.
This was all very brand new for me, very brand new.
But I read somewhere that you had actually spoken about feeling, I think the quote was, you felt like the king of the world at the time.
That was just a reflection on the fact that I'd left, a normal suburban existence, and all of a sudden, I'm living in the eastern suburbs. I've been in a theatre production for 2.5 years. I've already had one hit record, and here I am recording something else that sounds really good to me, and it might be another hit. Well, why wouldn't you feel like king of the world? Yeah.
Did you want it to go on and on and on?
I didn't think it would. You'd be crazy not to want it to go on and on, but it never really entered my head that it would. I thought if I get 3 years out of this, I'd be very happy.
You had Love is in the Air, which was 1977-78.
Yeah.
And then already by 1980, I think you'd cut your hair and you were already talking about in some of the newspaper articles about, the heady days being over.
Yeah. Well, only because it was put to me earlier. It wasn't put to me, but it was, I can't remember if it was a newspaper article or whether I heard it on radio, but I was a veteran. Somebody called me a veteran in 1981, and I've never forgotten it. And I thought, wow, doesn't take long. It does not take long. So, that was that, So I thought, well, okay, so I've just got to readjust. I've got to adjust. I can't, there's no point beating your head against a brick wall. And it's kind of like that now. I've only got to look at people like Paul McCartney and Elton John and Rod Stewart and, and all those people and think, well, yeah, when was their last hit? So it's a thing that happens, as you get older, that you kind of just, it's not even falling out of favour. I don't know what it is, but you're just not top of the tree anymore. And that's fine.
But at the time, you had that quote from, I think, Marsha Hines, who said, they prepare you for the climb up, but not the slide down.
Yeah.
You eventually moved out of Sydney. I think you had your partner and 2 small children. You
Yep.
relocated to Lake Macquarie.
Mm-hmm.
Did you feel you were eating humble pie? Was it hard for you?
No. As a matter of fact, I really felt like my father again. I felt like that I had to take a risk, like he took a risk. And I thought, well, I've got to take a chance here. And the most important thing is how I'm going to look after the family, not my career. Because as far as I was concerned, the career was gone. It really was gone. There was really not much point to it anymore. There was no George and Harry anymore. There was, it was all finished, basically.
Did you mourn that?
No, I didn't mourn it. I'm just, every day I wake up and I'm so glad it happened. It wasn't a very nice thing at the time. I mean, it certainly was pretty traumatic to pick up everything and go. It was not easy, but I'm so glad I did it. I think it made me in a way.
I've never read anything about you that talks about you being addicted to drugs, being addicted to drink, going off the wall in some
we
way.
can all be grateful for things you haven't read, I suppose. Yes.
Well, I was wondering, was it such a kind of easy transition in terms of the inner person?
Well, it wasn't easy, but it wasn't insurmountable either.
You didn't go off the rails.
No. As a matter of fact, if anything, I hunkered down. You know, I closed up shop. You know, and I thought, well, I haven't got any money now, so I've got to start again. And so I arrived in Lake Macquarie relatively with a lot of money compared to what everybody else had in Lake Macquarie, apart from the odd wealthy coal miner. I was there and I was starting again, you know, and again, fortune smiled on me because an old DJ friend of mine rang me up and said, I've got a radio show in Townsville and my breakfast man is having a week off. Would you like to come up and help me do the breakfast show? And I went up and I did that with him. And then he said, as a matter of fact, I've been asked to be program director to a new FM station in Newcastle. Would you be interested? And I said, yes. So that started a whole new chapter in my life, you know.
In 1992, Baz Luhrmann's Strictly Ballroom came out. Love is in the Air was resuscitated after more than a decade.
Love is in the air. Love is in the air.
Did you go, oh no, or did you go, yes?
I didn't do either. I was a non-believer, really. Yeah, I thought it was nice. I thought it was very pleasant, and it was lovely, and but I didn't think radio was going to grab it. It was a big surprise to me. You know, I mean, I loved the track and everything, but I just didn't get it.
You didn't get why it was going to be a comeback?
No, I was eternally grateful that it did happen because it got me out of radio. I was just as happy to get out of radio as I was to get in it.
Tell me, why is it that iconic singers and performers always end up broke? Why is there always a broke phase?
I don't know. I suppose in a way, you know, I know why I went broke, because I took my eye off the ball. I was just guilty of having a good time. I was just, you know, I was just throwing money around like there was no tomorrow. You know, I really was just tossing it around, you know, to the point where I had to sell my house.
What was your poison, if I could ask?
Just life. It was nothing,
So
no one thing.
wild parties, good
Yeah,
cars, everything.
Everything. Yeah.
Generosity to your friends and
Yes.
loved ones.
Yes. I mean, when I think of the birthday party I put on for my keyboard player, thank God he's still with me. We put a birthday party on for him on Shark Island in the harbour, and bought him a piano, which I tried to have flown in by helicopter, but the Department of Civil Aviation said, no, you're not allowed to sling a load over a neighbourhood. So we weren't allowed to do that. So we put it on a barge, and it came round the corner, and he said, they bought me a barge. No, there was a piano on the barge. But that was one hell of a party. So much so that National Parks and Wildlife barred anybody from having parties on the island from then on.
Good that you snuck it in.
We did.
Let's fast forward to a few years ago, and you performed that incredible song Evie at Stevie Wright's funeral. He hit life hard,
Oh, yeah.
Stevie Wright.
Yeah.
What sort of things did you think about knowing that, you know, this person who was pretty much of your ilk
Yeah.
died way too early, obviously had his demons,
Mm-hmm.
but as a mature man, how did you put that into context?
Well, it's kind of, what can you do? What do you say when, you know, when people's lives follow a path, you know? And certainly not totally controlled by Stevie. Sure, he made some mistakes, but I don't think there's any blame or anything. That's just what happens, you know. Things happen to people, and things, you know, I'm just so grateful that I've been able to scrape through.
Do you wonder about your legacy?
No, I haven't, not until recently. You know, people started comparing me to, well, not comparing me, but putting me in the same bag as Johnny O'Keefe and Cole Joy and people like that. You know, and I'd never ever thought that my life would turn into that. You know, it's I don't know, it just makes you feel a bit odd. You know, you think, oh, I have done that. You know, but it's not something I think of daily. You know, it's just a bit of a slap across the face every now and again. You know, wake up.
How much of your life did your parents get to see and share?
Yeah, well, you know, they got to share the big house at Bronte overlooking the ocean. So that was great. Yeah, you know, and my father died when he was 59, you know, which was like...
Early.
Yeah, that tore me apart.
When you hit 59, did that come back to you?
Yeah, it's still there, you know, because every year, you know, it's like, I've made it. And that's... He really didn't get to enjoy to the fullest what he did. So that's kind of my life is to, I'll try and live it for him, you know.
And you have.
Yeah. No, I'm happy about that. Yeah.
You've had a really fortunate life.
I have. It's been very lucky, and I think that's one thing a lot of people don't realise is that there's so much luck involved in showbiz. Having talent, having a good song, having all these things is not necessarily any guarantee of success. You've got to have the breaks. You know, the breaks have to be there. You know, and when they're there, you've got to take them too. You know, it's... I've turned my back on a couple of things, and none that I can actually think of straight away. But generally, if there's a gap there, I go for it.
I'm not going to call you John Paul Young, because now I know you didn't really like Paul. I'm going to say John Young. Thanks so much for joining me on 1+1.
Thank you.
That was the 70s pop singer John Paul Young. You can find 1+1 on iView. We have a website where you can watch previous episodes, and you can contact me on Twitter and Facebook. I'll be back here next week. See you then.
We have a board that does it.
Join Jane Hutchin as she explores the people behind the faces.
Eddie Perfect, welcome to 1+1.
Let's do this.
What is it that you've gone in search of?
I'd forgotten who I was without music.
The work of the cartoonist is to represent those who are underrepresented.
Don't give up. Just keep going no matter how many bad reviews you get.
My mother was in the hospital bed. I told her the child was going to be small like me. And she said, "Don't worry. We'll look after the little one, just like we looked after you."
I'd spent, 40 years, trying to drink and party myself to death. And, and so until 5 years, 5 years is a lifetime when you start living.
1+1, tomorrow on ABC News.